Now, all of this sets the stage for our Sherlock Holmes stories. And finally, well, we don't have much time to talk about them at this point. However, I think this is important because we have to understand Sherlock Holmes as someone who now is made possible by the changes, the dramatic changes of the preceding century. These stories could not have been written 100 years earlier. Partly because the conception of scientific method wasn't there, partly because this conception of a middle-class existence, of someone who could make their living as a detective that other people would hire. Who would have the money for this? This is something that really is fairly new. Here you see Doyle himself. And there is Sherlock Holmes with his trusted friend Watson. Now, these stories have been very influential. Here is one modern incarnation of them. Here's another. And actually, the House television show is really the application of Sherlock Holmes to medicine. That was the inspiration. So what is Sherlock Holmes like? Before we get to all of the quotes I want, tell me about Sherlock Holmes. What is he like? Yeah. Very rational, exactly. Rationality is maybe his main attribute. What else?
Narcissistic.
Say it again.
Narcissistic.
Narcissistic. He is rather self-centered, I've got to admit that. Yeah.
Emotionally unavailable.
Emotionally unavailable. That's right. Emotions seem to make hardly a wave in his psyche. Yeah.
He lives alone by himself with a landlady.
Good. He lives, yes, in a room in a house that's controlled by someone else. He has a landlady. He lives alone. He doesn't seem, except for Watson, he really doesn't seem to have any friends or any romantic interests or anything like that. Yeah.
He's clever.
He's very clever. Yes. Highly intelligent.
Really observant.
Very observant. Yes, absolutely.
Resourceful.
Resourceful. Yes, he comes up with all sorts of ideas, all sorts of substances, and so on at the spur of the moment. Yeah.
He's an addict.
He is an addict. He is a drug addict, which is an important fact about him.
He lives a bohemian lifestyle.
He does live a bohemian lifestyle. It's, his way of living is something that requires a certain level of affluence in society at large, and yet he himself, though he seems to do well, it's not, he never seems concerned about money and doesn't seem interested in anything consumerish. You never see him say, Watson, look at my new coat or my new shirt, or look at this piece of equipment I picked up or anything else. So he seems oblivious to all of that. Anything else about Holmes? Yeah.
He's supposed to be this character that can look at things so analytically that no one else would be able to recognize it. Like he doesn't have any fixed functionness. Like he's supposed to be able to see it so, like you said, rationally, but in a different light. Yes.
Okay, good. He sees things rationally. He sees them objectively. He doesn't seem to be sort of skewed by any kind of emotion or anything else. His own personality seems, in a way, devoid of all this. He's showing you where he's capable of observing things that are the way they are without his own personal aspects of it entering in much at all. And this story is one of the few where anything personal seems to enter in.
He's a savant.
He is a savant, yes. He's capable. He not only knows a huge amount and is very intelligent, but he seems to do this by processes that he then explains as mere deduction, but in fact everybody else finds extraordinarily mysterious. Now, here is how he's introduced. All emotions, and that one particularly, that is to say love, were abhorrent to his cold, precise, but admirably balanced mind. He was, I take it, the most perfect reasoning and observing machine that the world has seen. So, no emotions, reasoning, observing. He's like a machine. Okay? These are important characteristics of Holmes. But for the trained reasoner to admit intrusions by emotions like love, due to his own delicate and finely adjusted temperament, was to introduce a distracting factor, which might throw a doubt on all his mental results. So the idea isn't just that Holmes has no emotions. He suppresses his emotions. He sees his emotions as a threat to his rationality. And so he thinks it's vital that he uses reason to figure things out, and emotions are to be gotten rid of. They just get in the way. So Hume said reason is and ought to be the slave of the passions. Holmes is basically following Plato here and saying, no, it's the opposite. Reason isn't always, but nevertheless always ought to be the master of the passions. And so the passion should be a slave to reason, not the other way around. Well, if he is then the anti-Hume, let's go back to this question of observation. He observes things that other people don't observe. He tells Watson, you see, but you do not observe. The distinction is clear. Now, what is this distinction between seeing and observing? Well, here is how he explains it to Watson. For example, you've frequently seen the steps which lead up from the hall to this room. Frequently. How often? Well, some hundreds of times. Then how many are there? How many? I don't know. Quite so. You've not observed. And yet you have seen. That's just my point. Okay, think about this classroom. Lots of you walk down to the front row here. You walk down a series of stairs. How many were there? I don't know either, right? I've done it several times now, but I would have to stop and count. I have seen them. In fact, I'm seeing them right now, but I'm not observing in the sense that I'm not seeing how many there are, even though I'm looking at them here. Unless I stop and count, I don't observe. And Holmes's point is people are like that all the time. We're actually very inattentive to what's going on around us. We see it, but we don't really observe it. We don't pay attention to it. How many people are in this classroom right now? I have no idea, yet I'm looking around and seeing you all right at this moment. But I would have to stop and count, and it's something I rarely do. So in short, this is something that actually is surprising. We pay attention to actually a very small part of our both visual field, and even most of the information in it we proceed to discover. Close your eyes for a moment, and tell me what color these chairs are.
Chairs going by the table.
No, the ones you're sitting in. Okay, some are saying blackish, some are saying brown. Yeah, actually, now that I'm looking at them, I can't tell you what color they are either. They're sort of goldish, brownish, something or other. Institutional ambiguity in the colors. But anyway, yeah, that's something that, at least if I were in your position, I'd be sitting there, or even before I thought of that, if I had just closed my eyes and said, now, what color are the chairs? I doubt I could have told you. Now, yes, a little story. In Chinese philosophy, there was a 14th century philosopher, Wang Yangming, who stressed the importance of the investigation of things, and he was raised this way as a good Confucian, but then he thought, well, I'm going to practice this. So he decided that he would observe things and investigate things by observing the nature of the grass. So the story says that for 7 days he watched the grass grow and watched it bend and wave in the wind. And at the end of that, he said, you know what? That was utter bunk. I didn't learn a thing about the grass. Okay? Because the investigation of things requires more than just watching. So it starts with seeing and moves to observing, but you got to do more than observe. Presumably you observed a lot of the grass and ended up by the end of the week saying, still, I know nothing about what makes the grass really do any of that. It requires scientific method. And that's what Holmes uses. We don't just watch, we don't even just observe. We ask questions. We attend to various relevant factors. We formulate hypotheses. We test those hypotheses experimentally. And we remain open to new information. It's very important that Holmes remains open. He is constantly looking for new bits of data, new bits of information. He's trying out hypotheses. He thinks, all right, maybe it's this way. And so he goes off, usually without explanation to Watson, to say, I'll be back in a while, Watson. And you find out he's gone, and what has he done? He's tested a hypothesis. He said, I think maybe so-and-so is doing this, and that's what's producing the strange thing we're seeing. He goes off to find out whether that's true. And so he's constantly involved in this process, not merely of observing passively, but actively testing, saying, wait, maybe this is what's happening behind the scenes. He formulates a hypothesis, he goes out and tests it by observing something that he, in some cases, creates, as in this story. There's one other thing besides Holmes's character and scientific method that's very important in this story, the role played by photography. Photography turns out to be crucial to the story. At one point, the king comes in, and he's telling Holmes this story, okay? And about a former affair, basically, that is now, when he's going to be married, potentially very embarrassing to him. And Holmes says, I fail to follow your majesty. If this young person should produce her letters for blackmailing or other purposes, how is she to prove their authenticity? And the king says, well, that is the writing. Forgery. My private notepaper. Stolen. My own seal. Imitated. My photograph. Oh, what? We were both in the photograph. Oh dear. That is very bad. Your Majesty has indeed committed an indiscretion. Now, what makes them both being in the photograph so bad?
It's real.
It's proof, right? Okay, now notice, photography is really special in that way. That seems to be proof that they knew each other, that there was such a relationship. And other things aren't like that. Okay, why is it so bad? Well, there's something very special about photography. Suppose somebody did a movie about this story, right? They said, aha, there's this movie. Oh, well, sorry. The thing is perfect, so I have to put on my best imitation of The Simpsons imitating Arnold Schwarzenegger, imitating a German accent. Anyway, people bought in the movie. That doesn't have much power, right? I mean, movies can be fictional. That doesn't prove anything. What about this? Someone has written a story about a love affair. Well, big deal, right? They made it up. Someone has done a painting of a stolen kiss between us. Well, again, the painting, that didn't really have to happen. Someone has done a different kind of painting. That no one will understand. It's quite all right. But a photograph. Oh, now that means something different. Why? What makes photography different from painting, different from storytelling, making a movie, having a play, etc.? Yeah.
Because up until recently, you couldn't manipulate that. There was no photo editing the same way we have now. So that was like,
ooh, yeah, it's hard to edit a photograph. Now, these days it's easy. Actually, Roy's going to talk a lot about this, and we'll see that even in the early days it was not that hard. However, there's something about photographs, even though we know they can be manipulated, that leads us to think a photograph plays a special role. Yeah?
Well, in a photograph, you're capturing something that's happened.
Good, you're capturing something that has happened, and there's a direct causal process. You can explain how the camera works. Like here is one of those famous photographs of the 20th century. And you see the photograph and you think, whoa, who are those two people kissing? They were strangers, by the way. They had never met before and never met later. But now, you think the kiss took place, right? You don't look at that and say, well, that's probably made up. They could be doctored and so on. What odds are, that's good, right? The natural thing the camera does is take a picture of what's actually there. We use cameras at the finish lines of races. We don't just have writers sitting there. We don't just have artists sitting there sketching at the race. We actually have a camera there because it tells us in a close case who actually got there first. Now, there's times when a photograph is limited in its ability. Here it's a custom photograph, but still you can see the license plate number on the car, and so it gives you some information. Here you've got actually a little bit of a double image of Doyle himself. Nevertheless, you get a pretty clear idea of what he looked like. So here's the idea. There's a causal process here, and the normal outcome of the causal process is actually an accurate representation of what really happened. Now you can have some natural thing interfere with the process. You can have it artificially tampered with. Nevertheless, the natural way the process goes actually gives you accurate information about what was going on. So you might say, look, it's the same with my eyes. My eyes can be tricked. Sometimes they, in fact, I say with my glasses, you no longer look like human beings, but sort of test-colored blobs. However, normally and properly adjusted, the eye gives you accurate information about the world, and the same thing is true of the camera. So things can go wrong, things can be manipulated, but on the other hand, normally things work out right and give you an accurate picture. The hard fact was circumstances rarely misled and appearances were always full of truth. That's why a 20th century novelist just happens to be one of my favorite quotes, but it illustrates the point in a way. Normally we get things right. Normally our eyes tell us what's actually happening. Normally a photograph tells us what's actually taken place. Now, we've only got about a minute left, so I will deal with Irene Adler very quickly. At the outcome of all of this, she says, as to the photograph, your client may rest in peace. I love and am loved by a better man than he. The king may do what he will without hindrance from one whom he has cruelly wronged. Now, at this point, the king says, oh, what a woman! What a woman! Did I not tell you how quick and resolute she was? Would she have not made an admirable queen? Is it not a pity she was not on my level? And Holmes says, from what I've seen of the lady, she seems indeed to be on a very different level from your majesty. Now, that tells us a lot about Doyle's ideals. Holmes is an Enlightenment ideal, but I'm going to just skip up to the point where, the king represents something here, and Adler represents something. We don't really have time to discuss it now, but I want you to think about that now. What does each represent? And why does she, Holmes, represent the ideal of the Enlightenment? Why does the king not represent it? Next time, we'll turn to the philosophy